Welcome to the Enneagram Global Summit. I'm just filled with joy to welcome you to this particular session today called Keys to the Enneagram, Principles and Practices with our faculty, Hamid Ali. Hamid has been a speaker on the Shift Network Enneagram conferences for some years now, and he's written 2 books on the Enneagram, the highly acclaimed and widely read Facets of Unity, detailing how he uses the Enneagram for spiritual illumination. And now his new book, Keys to the Enneagram, that's just come out, detailing how each Enneatype is built around an ego ideal. Hamid, I'm truly honored and just thrilled to be having what I consider an essential conversation for this global summit this year.
I'm glad to be of help or use in this case. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'll just let everyone know that I have read this book several times. I was first asked to do a review and I was just thrilled. I feel that books about the Enneagram that are able to clearly articulate the relationship between our ego fixation, our fears, our temperament, and our potential to awaken to true nature are still so needed in the field. And this is just a book that is bringing clarity to so many aspects of how it is that a human being can truly awaken. So, Hamid, could you maybe start by telling people what ego ideal means and why you're writing about it?
Each ego has an ego ideal. You cannot have an ego without an ego ideal. The ego is the usual sense of self that everybody has, grow up with. So spiritual tradition call it ego. Most people call it me or self or individual. But the ego or the sense of self is as a psychic structure, the structure of thoughts, feelings, emotions that has developed throughout one's life to develop an overall sense of who one is, how one recognizes oneself, and patterns one's states, expressions, and behavior and life. But it is guided, the whole thing is guided by what's called the ego structure. I mean, the ego ideal. So the ego ideal is that the ego always wants to be some way, not just want to be somebody. He wants to be a particular somebody that according to an image of being a human being that they tend to value, admire, and aspire to. And that's called idealization. Yeah, they idealize that. So each person idealizes a certain image of what a human being is. So, and that image develops as part of the structure of the ego for everybody. And it's part of the ego structure. And in some sense, it gives the ego structure its guidance of how to be. It actually informs the ego and how it develops its patterns, its preferences, ways of behavior, and goals in life, and how to behave, how to be in the world. That's so an ego ideal. If you're identified with the self, you're still in the self, you must have an ego ideal, which is how you think the best way to be.
Could you give us an example of one type and how you would describe their particular ego ideal?
Yeah, like the ego ideal, for instance, for number 3 is efficiency and success. To be a successful, efficient, functional human being in society. And so the importance is efficiency in functioning. It's not like number two, which is the idea is helpfulness and giving. It's a very different flavor. So if you want to be an efficient and effective in your functioning, that is the ideal that actually develops the characteristics of a type number three. And because we know number three, success is important for them, and they're usually very effective, efficient. They do succeed, most of them, and they are very good at usually what they choose to do, because that is part of that type, is to be good in what they do, to be successful in the society they are in. So the ego ideal part depends on culture and society, but it's mostly built through one's experience from childhood and school and all that. So that's an example, a clear example of ego ideal, that was number three.
Now, you explain in the book that there are two ways to contact our essential self or our true nature. And one is through understanding our ego ideals. And the other, of course, is through the understanding of the deficiencies, or as you call them in the diamond approach, the holes that we incur through our early childhood and growth because of missing experiences and mirroring and different things that don't happen. So I'm really curious about your description of how the ego ideal points us towards our true nature, or understanding our ego ideal points us towards our true nature. And maybe you could use an example with that as well.
Yeah, good point, Jessica. Well, I'm always trying to put out something that will be useful for some individual to have access to their spiritual nature, to have some sense of freedom, liberation, and realization of presence or pure consciousness. And since I know there are many people these days aware of the Enneagram and read the Enneagram book and study it, I thought I could put out something that will help those people who know the Enneagram, to some degree, to use their knowledge of the Enneagram as a way to help them access their deeper sense of self, the more authentic self of true being. And of course, first, we need to understand that's why you ask the first question, we need to understand what is an ego ideal. Because part of the picture here is that the configuration of the type is determined to a large degree by the ego ideal. And the ego ideal is always operative, guiding us or dictating how we are, what are our goals, how we behave. And most people are not aware that they have an ego ideal. So the first thing is to be aware that you have an ego ideal, that you have an idea, an image of how you want to be, what kind of person you like to be, and how you want to put yourself out in the world to be satisfactory for you, whether success or helpfulness or strength or being right or being good. All these are ego ideal. But so the first thing is to be aware that you have an ego ideal. Then to understand, to see the ego, to begin to recognize it in your thinking and your behavior, to recognize the patterning of the ego ideal. So the book goes through describing each ego ideal for each type. So that way, if somebody is reading that and they reflect on their understanding and their experience of their type, they might begin to see where the ego ideal is, which part of it is the ego ideal, and that will recognize the importance and the significance and power of the ego ideal. So first, to recognize there is an ego ideal. Second, to become aware of one's own ego ideal, not just as thought, but how it impacts you, how it has been directing your life, basically, directing your development. And so, and as we become aware of our ego ideal, And the next thing is to recognize that even though we have this ego ideal, we never attain it. We never completely attain it.
Mm.
Nobody ever attained the ego ideal because it's an ideal. You're moving toward it, you aspire, but you don't get to it. And part of the reason why we cannot get to it, because it is an approximation or a derivation of something that is true, that is part of our being, but we're not aware of it. So the ego ideal doesn't develop out of nothing, doesn't develop because of your childhood or your astronomical sign, or it developed because of your type. It's and the type tends to determine how your developmental experience patterns which ideal you end up developing. And so we recognize that there's an ego, we recognize our ego ideal, we recognize a certain pattern, and then to sort of take a step back and see that I'm trying to live up to this, I'm aspiring to this, but where does this come from?
Mm-hmm.
You see, where does this ego ideal come from? Because it really comes from the type, because the type, as I mentioned in the book, each type has what I call an essential endowment. We are born with a particular pure quality of spirit being more dominant for us, that can become more accessible for us, and other ways spirit can be experienced and recognized. And we tend to have some experience of it in our developing years in early life. But then it got lost in the development of the ego, because the ego dissociates, always doesn't keep presence, because it's a mental structure, and spiritual nature is something is an isness, is a beingness that cannot be captured in concepts or images. So we experience it. We don't know we're experiencing it as kids, but we grow up having a sense of it, some feeling, some intimation, that then orient our mind to want that, because we felt how it is, and we appreciate it because it is us. This is something dominant in us. And so we want to be that because we want to be ourselves, really. But since we have forgotten exactly what it is, we have all those intimations, all those sort of intuitive sense of what it can be, that then become mixed with all kinds of things we learn and as we grow in our family, in our culture, in our school. So we end up with some kind of approximation, a facsimile of the actual quality that we actually have and had experienced. And this facsimile, this approximation, has a little distortion. It's not exactly an exact description, an exact image of the true quality. It is a little bit, because an approximation is not exact, and because of the various influences in childhood and schooling and culture and all of that, it become changed around and twisted. So the approximation becomes some kind of distorted approximation. Now we need to recognize when we experience recognize our ego ideal, we need to be aware, recognize that it is a distortion, and we need to see the forces that has helped distort it. We might see the history of its development. That's one way of exploring it, to recognize how it developed, what went into it. We might see the influences, our education or our upbringing, that so went into the development of the ego ideal. And as we see these, our picture of our ego ideal can begin to move and shift and become closer to what is real thing. But regardless how close or accurate it is to the real thing, which actually would differentiate how fixated one is and one's type, partly depends on how close is the approximation to the real thing. Because some threes, for instance, are really efficient in a good way and in doing good things. But most of them are there because they want to get ahead and want to succeed. When you realize at some point that it is not about succeeding, it's about being an effective human being who live right living that really works for life. That begins to correct the ego ideal, and as that becomes corrected, you still recognize at some point it's just an image of something. And then when you recognize that, you want to know what's the image of. And you might become aware of the initial intimations, initial intuitions that you actually came out of the initial experience. And as you become aware of those initial then you can follow the scent, sort of. And that can lead us to something that we recognize, and we find something in us, in ourselves, in our own consciousness, in our own being, that we see, that's what I really want to be, because that's what I am. I get disconnected from it. So of course, I've always want to be that way, because that is a central thing about how I am in the world. And that becomes now a way for somebody who has explored the Enneagram and explored it in a way to understand themselves, not just to know their type, but to understand their pattern in a deep way and to be free from the rigidity and the fixation of it. It becomes possible to sort of go through the ego ideal to its original sources. And the original source is the actual true quality of presence. And then that becomes a way to accessing our true nature, which is different from what I usually do with the rest of my work.
Yeah, so Hamid, you have a beautiful description of a kind of process that you yourself experienced along those lines in the book. And I'd like to just read it. It's so very inspiring. You were talking about a retreat that you were at, I think when you were a student of Claudio Naranjo's, and you say, toward the end of that time in 1973, we were given a practice called the 3 days of prayer, which was done in solitude. I prayed constantly for hours at a time each day. On the third day, after the prayers had exposed the pretenses of ego, I had a profound and complete experience of ego death. But it was not just an ego death experience or awakening, as the term is used these days. It was a particular kind of ego death, which I refer to as the Sarmoon type of ego death, to differentiate it from other types of ego death that occurred at later times. As I saw the pretenses and identification of ego clearly, I felt quite helpless to break free of them, for they happened so fast, one after the other, like an unstoppable stream of impressions, thoughts, and beliefs. At this point, when I saw there was nothing I could do to free myself because I was too mired in ego, there occurred a descent of spiritual grace or energy, and I felt myself showered with, immersed in, and enveloped by a fluid substance of pure consciousness. Hamid, as I've read that passage several times, I keep coming back to this incredibly pivotal line where you say, when I saw that there was nothing I could do to free myself because I was too mired in ego, then there occurred a descent of grace. So this pathway of understanding the ego ideal and not backing away from the awareness of it becomes pivotal, so that it's sort of like the more you understand, the less there's any out, right? The less there's any kind of, approximation or delusion that you can create, that there's still some other doorway that the ego can create.
Right.
And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Well, a part of the way of working with it is to understand our ego ideal, where it's come from, without having a goal in mind, without thinking that I'm trying to get someplace, I'm trying to get to my quality. You're doing it because you really want to understand yourself. Because if you've been working with Enneagram, you want to understand yourself, how you are, what got you to be the way you are, what makes you behave this way. So you continue this understanding, which means you want to really know the truth about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And wanting to know the truth about yourself is not trying to get to any truth. The truth is manifesting. You just want to see it. So, however, the ego is always pushing to get someplace. And that is usually how the ego ideal works. It tries to tell you, it's always telling you, go over there, go that way. So if you become free of the ego ideal, you're not trying to go one way or another. You're not trying to be one way or another. When we, at some point, recognize, and also we recognize at some point, if you follow my example there, you recognize, even though I'm not trying to live up to the ego ideal, I realize I can't stop trying. Because we've done it all of our life. Our mind and our psyche is sort of wired like that. This is actually our neural programming. So when you realize I can't really do it, when you get to that place, knowing it, understanding it, but seeing you still can't help but try to be that ego ideal, you get to a place of helplessness. That's what I was talking about when I said I can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be a felt helplessness without seeing it as something wrong, just a fact.
Mm-hmm.
I can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody can do it. I can't do it. I'm too stuck. I am the product of this. So how can I get out of something that I'm the product of? You can't get out of ego from within ego, in other words. So this point of helplessness is important in all spiritual methods. In all the meditations, all the practices, it's always supposed to take you to the place of helplessness, place you can't do anything. That's when you drop the effort. You can't help but drop it. And that when grace can happen and the quality can arise.
Reminds me of Rumi saying that we must learn to hatch out the helplessness inside. That is from one of his poems. And Hamid, there's another really provocative and thrilling aspect to this book. I really haven't heard, I don't recall any author really writing about it quite in this way, where you talk about, as we are becoming more aware of the ego ideal and the ego structure, we may even get to a point where, well, first of all, you make the very important point that we have all 9 fixations in us, regardless of our dominant fixation. And of course, therefore, we have all 9 essential qualities of being within us. And I think that's so very important. And this point was about that as we're seeing our ego ideal, we may even start to wonder if we're other types. We may even go around the Enneagram and think, I wonder if I'm this, or I wonder if I'm that. And I wonder if you could speak to that phenomenon. And also, so when we're talking about ego dissolution, shall we say, or death, does that mean in a way that we have, in a sense, grasped or grokked all 9 of the fixations and they're all dissolving?
Well, you can have an ego death by working with one of the idealizations, one of the ego ideals, and getting to that quality. However, that doesn't mean you're liberated. I mean, you can have ego death, you can have awakening, actually. Most awakened people are not completely liberated. They're awakened, they know what they are, but there's still parts of them that is not worked out. That's nothing unusual. So if you want to be more completely free, more completely open to the fullness of our spiritual nature, we need to see the other ideals we still have and that we have not yet recognized in us or haven't worked on them, worked through them, and haven't understood them. They haven't sort of died, you see. And so it's possible to have an ego death where all of them are dissolved, but that's not usual. Most usual that you go through one of them, even like in that, my experience of that ego death, you know, you probably is already in the book. I do mention I felt after it, I was all enlightened, clear, all of that. But the next day I realized it wasn't true. Because it was even experience of ego death doesn't mean ego died. You can have an experience of ego death while the ego can come back still, because it still has force, still has charge, still has ego structure that are not worked out. And they all really need to be clarified.
Now, in that beautiful description of that experience, before the next day you realized you weren't enlightened, you call it a Sarmoon ego death. Yeah. And, you know, for our people that are new to this, could you just briefly explain about the Sarmoon and its relationship to the lineage of the Enneagram?
Sarmoon was first mentioned by Gurdjieff, who first brought the Enneagram, the word Enneagram, and who brought to the West that diagram. And he said he got it from a secret community, spiritual community that was at that time in the Hindu Kush. In his travels, he was traveling around from Egypt, other places, trying to find the source of the real teaching, until he finally, if you read that, meetings with remarkable men, his book, he talks about that. At some point, he arrives at some place and he meets some of the Sarmoon, or they recognize he's looking for them. They take him in some kind of secret place in the Hindu Kush, in Bora Bora, actually, Hindu Kush, where Bin Laden was hiding. And at that time, you know, a long time, century ago or something, I don't know where they are now. And he says it is a spiritual school that is ancient, that goes back, you know, 5,000-6,000 years. J.G. Bennett, in his book about he said it goes back 10,000 years. And the idea of this ancient spiritual school is that beside it being exists in their way of looking at to be there in case humanity needs something extra. Humanity has time difficulties when teaching declines, when they need to be regenerated, when teaching need to originate, they bring in an infusion. You know, for instance, some people, for instance, believe that the idea of Mahayana Buddhism, especially the idea of true nature, Buddha nature, they believe it came from the Sarmoon. Many scholars believe that. They say it's not Buddhist. Buddha talk about no self. He didn't talk about Buddha nature. So some people believe the idea of Buddha nature came from outside of Buddhism, and they trace it back to Sarmoon sources. Gurdjieff said that that school is the source of the Enneagram, knowledge of the Enneagram. And that's his claim. I mean, I didn't go to the Hindu Kush, so I don't know. But that's what he said, and he and he was with them. He studied with them. He got not just the Enneagram, the Gurdjieff movements and other things about the whole fourth way that he taught. Is all mostly is based on his encounter with the Sarmoon community, and of course he learned from other things, Buddhist and Sufi, but that the main thing that he learned is from the Sarmoon. And then Oscar Ichazo, who brought the sort of the Enneagram of time that we know it, he also at the beginning said he learned it from Sarmoon or from Sufis who learned it from Sarmoon. So the Sarmoon somehow is behind the scene in terms of the actual source of the knowledge of the Enneagram, just like as it is in the Gurdjieff system, behind the system of centers, the three-brained beings. That idea came from the Sarmoon. There are many ideas like that that Gurdjieff brought, other people brought, that originate in the Sarmoon. And so that's one thing maybe some of your listeners might not know, they haven't heard about. They call them Sarmoon Dark, which means the beehive, because they consider themselves as bees collecting honey. And the honey is the spiritual nature.
Mm-hmm. And that collecting, like bees collecting honey, does sort of reflect the bringing in of all 9 capacities that, not just the one that are being.
Yes, I mean, I think, yes, that is one way of saying it, is that all the 9 and true nature in general, the Enneagram points to some of the most important qualities. There are other qualities, true nature, that are not reflected in the 9, because I know more than 30 qualities, for instance. And but the Enneagram really highlights some of the very most important qualities that are needed for living, needed for liberation.
So you called that ego death that you described there in the book as the Sarmoon ego type of death. And then you said there in this talk that there are other kinds of ego deaths.
Yeah.
And so why did you call that one a Sarmoon? And just give us a couple of examples of other types of ego deaths.
Because many kind of ego deaths, when people talk about ego death, they experience a sense, one kind is that they experience their ego or individual dissolving into pure consciousness. And there's no individual, there's just the ocean of consciousness. That's what many people call ego death. The more specific ego death that some Buddhist teaching talk about, it's called that Buddha talk about it. You call it the cessation of sensation and perception, which means it's a blackout. The consciousness completely disappears and it's gone. And Theravada Buddhism, they have many kind of cessation. They call it stream enterer. When you first experience cessation, you call it stream enterer. Then you can enter the stream several times, many times. Each one of them is an ego death. So that's another kind of ego death. So in my experience, it was a cessation. However, what brought out the cessation, right? Because for many kinds of cessation of consciousness, individual consciousness, not universal consciousness, so that there is a gap of experience. So, of course, the ego will fight this usually because it wants to live. So you have to come to terms with the fear or the terror of dying, because the ego believes if it's out of the scene, it's actual death, physical death. That's how it looks at it. So there's a terror and resistance. And that's why ego death is not easy for most people. But I call it Sarmoon not because of the cessation of experience, which is a kind of ego death, but what brought it about, which is the particular blessing that melted the ego, melted what's left. The ego was in a place, or the consciousness, the soul was in a place of helplessness. It can't do anything. And then that allowed a descent of a particular force. And that force appeared as honey-like love, sweet, full, rich sweetness that as it sort of descended like a fluid descending over me, it felt like it melted my body. But what really melted is my body image and my sense of self. And also, it wasn't just the honey, because they're which what the Sarmoon say they are collectors of honey. But in that experience of the descent of arising of honey and dissolving the ego, there was the sound of bees buzzing. It was like my room was full of bees, and I could tell there was no bees there. So it was obviously an inner experience. So both the honey and the bees makes it for me a Sarmoon. That reminded me that, oh, that's what the Sarmoon, that's a Sarmoon way of experiencing things.
Mhm.
So it was the Sarmoon blessings that occasioned that ego death.
Thank you, Hamid. And, one thing about the book, and I know in your teaching in general, many people, most people, when they teach the Enneagram, have a particular order that is chronological. People start at 1 and end at 9 when they teach. Some people, like myself and Russ Hudson, we start at type 8 because we say, the body we have to be here in order to even have a journey. And so we do 8, 9, 1, 2. And some people, like even in the narrative tradition, Helen Palmer School, sometimes they start with the core type of each center, like 9, and then go to 8 and 1. You have a particular order that's completely unique. So there's some teaching that you're trying to transmit through this. And I think it's like 8, 6, 2, 3, 4, 1, 7, 9, 5. And what you describe in the book is that it has to do with your experience that this is a kind of order of the ease with which we can, all of us, not just that type, but all of us can access these different qualities.
Yes, exactly. Because the different qualities are, people relate to different, when they hear the quality, relate to them differently. And some make more sense than others, and also more easily accessible in the sense that the barrier against them is not as thick, in terms, generally speaking, not for every individual. Generally, universally speaking, because I work with many people, many students, I could see what qualities are easier to experience, easier to access. So I start with 8 because it's one of the easiest qualities of presence to experience, to come in touch with. In fact, I did a particular meditation there, how to access it even without using the theory of whole that I use. I use a tantric method.
And can you say a little bit, so if we didn't go through every type, Hamid, but so 8 is easiest to access, but let's say.
So the strength, because strength is easiest to access.
Mhm.
Comes after that, I bring in will, the quality of personal will, a sense of inner confidence and inner solidity and support that makes us feel we can be we have sense of natural perseverance, natural capacity to stay with the task. And that is next in terms of ease. And I think third one, I bring in emerging goal, emerging essence.
Right.
Not many people want that, but that doesn't mean it's easy to access. Actually, the strength is easier to access than the golden love.
We're going from 8, we went from 8, 6, 2, and then your next one is 1, and what quality there, and why, just an explanation of why that takes a little bit more to connect with.
Quality of point 1, which is, of course, have to do with perfection and completeness, and the quality, what I call brilliancy, which has to do with spiritual intelligence. Intelligence, the essence of intelligence, intelligence as presence, the intelligence that informs all of our centers to be intelligent, and from our mind to be intelligent, from our heart to be intelligent, from our body to be intelligent. And that is a quality of presence that is a sense of liquid brilliance. I call it liquid radiance. And it is more difficult to access because, first of all, many people, their ideas of intelligence are in the way. Most people, intelligence is being clever, being smart, and being able to think in a smart way or do things in an intelligent way. So most of us think of intelligence as something a way of functioning, and most of the time mental functioning. While this quality of intelligence is not that at all. It is beyond that, and it's underneath that. It's several layers underneath that. And that quality is a very powerful, deep quality that rare that people experience. Like the merging gold, the quality of golden love, some people can experience it sometimes, like when they're in love, for instance. That if they're really open and their heart is open, they can experience it. They might not know it completely isolated or say, oh, that's what it is, but it can arise. The quality of point one, the brilliancy, doesn't arise as easily. The barrier against it are stacked up higher, partly because of our cultural orientation about our intelligence and our personal issues about what intelligence is, and also the way the distortion that happened in the ego ideal, and instead of recognizing it as intelligence has in it a sense of perfection that comes from a sense of completeness. When you experience yourself as that, you feel complete. I'm complete, because the intelligence, the quality of intelligence, there's something about interesting to say about this quality. It has all the other qualities in it, implicit in it. They're all there, but undifferentiated. So they're all there, and because each quality, if it becomes more intense, it becomes more brilliant. If it becomes totally intense, it's just pure brilliance. Now, all those brilliances are combined together in one quality, that is brilliance. So it has all the qualities in it together. That is why it's intelligence. Intelligence needs everything for it to function, be a real organic, natural intelligence. So that one is more difficult, not as difficult as some of the other one I talk about.
Yes, so next we get to 3. Maybe you could talk about the challenge of getting to that and why that comes next.
And 3, part of the difficulty with that is 3, the quality there is a sense of personhood, what I call the person of being. Because many, in fact, most spiritual traditions, when they think of being or consciousness, they think of it as an expanse, ocean or region of medium of presence or consciousness or truth, but they don't see it as a person. Person is what's in the way. However, this is a person, but this person is not ego. It is as you recognize yourself as a person, but a person of being, and that's what I refer to as the pearl beyond price. Mm-hmm. Recognize it as, because it's unexpected. In fact, many spiritual teachings don't know about it. So far from people's way of what they think is possible, most people don't expect it. They think, no, if somebody tells them, they say, no, there's no such thing. If you talk to most spiritual teachers, they'll tell you there's no such thing. You see.
And that reminds me, Hamid, to mention that one of your books is called Pearl Beyond Price, and it is absolutely one of my favorite books. I give it to all of my trainees. It's really the only book that connects object relations and ego deficiency with awakening, and it's just a seminal book.
But to see the pearl, the what I call the pearl equality or the personal essence, I call it personal essence, is such an unusual, unexpected. When I first discovered it, I had no idea there's something, I wasn't expecting it. But it is a sense of being a being of presence that has a capacity for personal contact, interaction, and personal functioning. You see, most people say, when I'm realizing non-dual, how do I live in the world? How do I actualize it? Well, you need the personal essence. And many don't know. Sometimes the teaching doesn't have it as part of their view. You need to function as an individual, because regardless how vast you are, you're going to have to function as an individual. How are you going to function as an individual without becoming an ego self? If you don't know the personal essence? So that becomes a big juncture for many people, that difficult to cross, because they just don't expect it, and the lack of expectation becomes the resistance. You see, because you don't conceive of it, so you don't allow it to happen.
The fragrance of what you're talking about recalls to me that Rumi poem that goes, whatever it is that's being said to the rose that makes it open, whatever it is that makes the sugar cane so sweet, that is being said to me right now here inside my chest.
Yeah, that's nice. That's a beautiful one, because that is the person, that quality of being, which what I call aspect of being, which in this case has an actual form, which is a rounded pearly form when it appears, is first of all, it has a form which is unusual. People are not used to forms unless it's an angel or something like that. You see, but it appears as, it looks like an actual pearl, but it feels more resilient, the way a muscle feels like a full, healthy, vigorous muscle. That's why it has to do with functioning, with capacity, and that's why threes want to become like that. They want to be efficient and effective, because that if you are the personal essence, you know how to function just right, just appropriately, just correctly, and which is what's needed to live in the world, actually.
Well, one of the memorable lines from this particular discussion is going to be, because we are a person, just not the ego. And I think
that's a good point. You can't be a person that is not an ego. Many of the non-dual teaching, they don't know how to be a person without being an ego. They think if you are a person, you must be an ego. And so this quality shows, no, you can't be a person without being an ego. Just like a wave in the ocean is part of the ocean, but the wave have a shape, a form that is not exactly the ocean. And in fact, everybody is a being. You know, even enlightened people, even though they experience themselves as vastness, that vastness is happening to somebody. So there's always an individual there and inherent in it. But this brings out not just the individuation, but the sense of being a person, which means it's personal. You know what, you begin to understand what personal means, what a person means too.
Well, let's unfold 4 and then 7, 9, and 5.
All of them, huh?
Yes, we have just a little bit of time.
Yeah. So 4, the ego ideal, of course, is originality and authenticity, because that's a reflection of the essential quality of the true, the center of our center of the soul, the true origin and of the individual soul, which is, many teachings see it as the point of light and presence that the Sargadatta Maharaj talks about. If you read Sargadatta Maharaj, he says, first you realize the I am. And then as you realize the I am reveals the secrets of reality, and including that you are the absolute. But when he discusses the I am, he said the I am is a point of light. A point of light, when you experience it, you realize, oh, that is what I am. That is who I am. So it is not a personhood, it's an identity. It gives you, you know, where a sense of identity comes from. That since we talk about that, you wonder, why do human beings all have a sense of identity? People don't ask that. How come we have identity? Where is this the feeling? I don't mean recognition that this is me. The feeling, there's a feeling of identity that this is my flavor. Where does that come from? It comes from this aspect because it has a feeling in it of pure identity.
So I can see why that would be, yes, more difficult to contact. And then
that brings self-realization.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the quality that changes the spiritual experience to realization, to being, instead of experiencing presence, being it. The point is the point of transition. And that's why Nisargadatta, I think, talks about it, sees it as important.
And then we get to 7. Tell us about the child, why that is so near the end in terms of the ease of contacting it.
That's because the 7, the 7, as you know, is a dilettante. They're always jumping from one thing to another. They're adventurers. They want to experience everything, and they want to enjoy this and that, and so. Like if you are in health, you're always in some kind of one health kick or another, and it doesn't last more than a few weeks, and then they go to the next one, and then the next one, the next one. Or if it's in food, they go from one kind of cuisine to another, and they keep doing that. And if it is spiritual teaching, they go to this one, then to that one. They don't stick to the same thing. They want to sort of sample the various delights. And that's a reflection of the true quality, because the true quality is pleasure, but the pleasure of many kinds. So why is this difficult is that we move from one quality to a configuration of qualities. Because one of the things that appear in the path, like the way I teach it, is that the quality can configure themselves in what I call a vehicle, become like a vehicle, an inner body, a kind of body. And I call it the body of pleasure here, the vehicle of pleasure. So it has all the qualities of presence, but each one of them as pleasure. Mm-hmm. So even compassion feels pleasure, joy feels pleasure, love feels pleasure, intelligence feels pleasure, like a kind of pleasure, stillness feels a kind of pleasure. So we know, of course, all consciousness is bliss and pleasure, but here is a very explicit experience of pleasure and the teaching of what pleasure is about and what is the pleasure of being compared to the pleasure of ego.
So the next type, Hamid, is so fascinating to me because it's 9. And 9s as people, ego people, think of themselves as so unimportant. And yet here you have that they're the second to the last quality, one of the hardest to connect with. Can you just say briefly about that?
That takes us to what I call dimensions of true nature. Because then we have what I call the boundless dimension, which is, so far I'm talking about qualities that can be locally experienced in your body, in your heart, in your belly, or in your room, or you're expanded one way or another, but it's not an universal, boundless, everywhere, an infinite ocean. The quality, point 9, is an infinite ocean of love that is always giving. And that is more difficult because that requires letting go of one's defining boundaries that defines us as an individual or as a self. So I call them ego boundaries, and they're usually the boundaries of the body, because we always believe our sense of who we are always has in it the body boundaries. Here, the boundaries have to go. They're an image of the mind. They're really, when we just experience our body naturally without an image, we don't feel the edges of it. It becomes a field of sensation. And when we are able to feel that, which is another death, you see, it's a death of the boundaries of the self, another ego death. that brings about what I call boundless experience of true nature. In this case, it's love, universal, pure, generous love, love for everybody, for everything. Everything is love. That's bring us like the Sufi tradition, you know, everything is love. That Rumi would love that one.
And Hamid, that leads us to 5. Tell us about why that's the last one.
Because it's really a way of experiencing non-dual realization. Because the idea here, the quality is again a constellation of aspects, of qualities, in a way, something that has to do with understanding, which is the higher intellect, which is the spiritual intellect. And 5s aspire to that, but they think they're aspiring to knowledge. But that's the distortion. While the aspiration, true aspiration, is to true understanding. And the quality of understanding here comes from well, I think I said something wrong. The non-dual side of it has to do with the holy idea, holy transparency. But there is corresponding to it what I call the higher intellect. And the higher intellect is not accessible to most people. It's not easily accessible. And even people from our school who have it manifest for them, they can't easily use it. There are some who can. It takes a great deal of development of consciousness, of mental capacity, and the higher intellectual center for this quality to manifest in a way that functions. And it is the most useful on the path, actually, because it is what the Buddha used for his enlightenment. It is the inquiring into experience to understand it. You know, that's what cuts through everything. You see, with compassion, with love, with intelligence. So it uses all the qualities: the compassion, the love, the intelligence, the strength, all of it together in a way that penetrates the barriers and open up things and reveals the truth of reality.
Well, Hamid, I think this session has been so full that it has done, I hope and pray it has done this Sarmun lineage reverence, because we have gathered so much. And I really want to truly thank you for your whole life's work, for the teachings you bring to the world, for Facets of Unity and your other books, Pearl Beyond Price, and especially for this new seminal essential book, I think, to the Enneagram literature, Keys to the Enneagram.
You're welcome. I think wherever the Sarmun are, I can tell they're happy.
Well, I'm happy too, and thank you.
Because their knowledge coming out, they want to have an impact on the world. They're always trying, so there's some little way they can have an impact through what they have given out.
Well, I hope we're joining the perennial conversation. I certainly feel like we could go on and on in this conversation.
Good questions, Jessica. It's been very nice session.
And great answers, Hamid. And thank you so much.
You're welcome. Till next time.